Welcome to Unlocking Moves, the podcast where we're going to cover the key decision points and pivotal moments that really change the trajectory of successful entrepreneurs. We're going to tell stories, and we're going to be very authentic about this. We want to hear not just the glory stories, but also the gory stories. Because as I like to say, the bigger the shit show, the bigger the lesson. Speaking of unlocking moves, my guest today is Mike Smerklo. You know him as a prominent VC with Next Coast Ventures. But Mike, as that prominent VC, I've got a hard-hitting question for you from the get-go. A few years ago or a few months ago, you posted a tweet, and I got to ask you a little bit of a backstory. The tweet is, tips I wish I'd learned in business school. Well, number one, I don't hire coke addicts. Number two, you're going to make mistakes. And number three, get help. So what the hell is the backstory in the coke addict comment?
Yeah, well, it's a great kind of, I wrote this book about the entrepreneurial journey. And I think everyone comes into it. You wouldn't be an entrepreneur if you thought about what could go wrong, right? It's all about the upside and how I'm going to be the next Howard Schultz or Phil Knight or whomever you choose it to be. So when I first started off, I raised capital to buy a company. That's how I became an entrepreneur. I was running a business that was growing quite rapidly, but was largely founder-led sales, which is me. And we came to a point where we had to go hire our first salesperson. And I made the mistake that I see over and over again with entrepreneurs. It's like, I didn't come up through sales. I need to go hire the air quote great salesperson. So I went and did a bunch of exhaustive interviews. I met a guy who had a really robust career in sales. He had great references. He had taken a couple years off. He'd moved to San Diego. He was, in semi-retirement, again, air quotes. And he just seemed like the guy that we needed to fit, but we didn't know what they were doing, so we hired him. Fast forward to the story. First couple weeks in, he tended to show up on Monday kind of tired. Looked like he had a lot of fun over the weekend. Drank a lot of coffee. One time he had some nail, like a razor cut on his thumb. We're like, oh, this isn't kind of weird. And then finally, after only a couple weeks in, I was on vacation, my first vacation. My business partner called me and said, Fred, I'll call him Fred, hasn't come into work. And he's missed really big meetings. So it turns out Sam / Fred was a raging coke addict. In his retirement, he had developed a small problem with cocaine, and really was not a functioning cocaine user, if there is such a thing. So we had to fire him. So a really good lesson. One, it's really hard to hire people. It's hard to hire head of sales, but if you can, avoiding coke addicts is a pretty good first step. So it was one of my real kick in the whatevers moments as an entrepreneur, and kind of showed me oh shit, hopefully I can say that on this podcast. We're in it. I'm running the show. I screwed up. I've got no one to blame. I got to go tell my board. This guy introduced to the company, introduced to the board, introduced to customers, is a coke addict. Not exactly a glowing way to start an early entrepreneurial career.
I love it. Hey, thanks for sharing. This is a great lesson, by the way, that whatever you put out on social media is there forever. So I don't know how long ago you posted that, but
yeah,
kids, whatever happens in Vegas stays on YouTube, as my friend Coleman likes to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, as you can tell, my guest today is Mike Smerklo. You might know him again as a prominent VC with Next Coast Ventures, but his story is much deeper than that. His story begins, I'm sure, with his blue-collar upbringing in Toledo, Ohio. He was also, like me, an alum of Ernst & Young and decided that wasn't for him. He spent a stint at Lehman Brothers, and then the big turn for him, as we've talked about before, is this Service Source, which is a company that he bought, small fledgling services company that he grew into a $300 million behemoth. And more importantly, that we'll talk about today, is he replaced himself as CEO, which I think a lot of us need to take that lesson to heart. Mike Smerklo, welcome to Unlocking Moves.
Thanks, Kurt. Great to be here.
Man, I'm so excited to have you. I want to talk a little bit about replacing yourself as CEO. Most of our audience is either entrepreneurs looking to scramble and become that next level company, and some may be in a position where they're trying to get to that next level and maybe they're not the guy or gal. So tell me a little bit about replacing yourself as CEO.
Yeah, I would say replacing is being nice. I think until I wrote the book, I kind of used that as my nice way to say, out of embarrassment, because I didn't get replaced. I got fired, would be the way I did. So a little bit of a judo for the story. I got fired after a 13-year history and a run. A great board member who I worked with and still a dear friend called me up and said, it's time to go. And I think I know my response was, yep, you're right. But got unceremoniously removed from the role. So I don't have a lot of great advice for replacing yourself. Again, it's kind of like the coke addict story. I can tell you how not to do it was my experience, but it all worked out fine. But that's how it ended.
Hey man, that's one of the themes of the Unlocking Moves podcast is we want to talk about those gory stories. So the story I just heard was you had done a tremendous job building the company where you could, but it was time to go. Somebody pointed that out for you, so you didn't notice it yourself. Although you did say you noticed it yourself, and you're still friends with that board member. So it can all end in a happy place, even if, and maybe especially if you're coached out or replaced.
Yeah, it's just, it's a great lesson because my big takeaway from that was I was tired. I was exhausted. It had been a great run. I was rewarding professionally and certainly financially. I became, in retrospect, I don't know if I fully realized it. I think self-awareness is so critical, but I became entitled. I think probably egotistical and grumpy, and just was exhausted. And I wasn't the leader that I had. It wasn't the reason I became an entrepreneur. I wanted to work with teams and build environments and really have that esprit de corps. And I think at the end, in retrospect, I just kind of, got fat, lazy, and tired, or whatever the saying is. I don't think I got those things, but that's how I was showing up. And I had gone to my board and said, I really think it's time. We had gone back and forth. The company was public. We tried to take it private. It had just gotten messy. And so the way it happened, the message that it's time for you to go was the right one. I just wish it would have been a little different. I joke with Bruce Dunleavy, who's the founder of Benchmark Capital, still a very dear friend of mine. I said, yeah, couldn't we have gone out and had a few bourbons and talked about it versus calling me up? But we were public. He had to move quickly, and the chapter ended. Wow, I like to say it's like if you ever watch a 2-hour movie, and you loved everything until the ending. That was my experience as an entrepreneur running ServiceNow.
If you're just joining us on Unlocking Moves, today's episode is brought to you as usual by HireBetter, the strategic talent partner for growth-minded entrepreneurs everywhere. I want to cover a lot of what you're sharing with us because this is real and authentic, and you're talking about some stuff that wasn't so glamorous for you. So you've obviously, if you didn't have it at the time, you do now. Humility. A number of things you write about in your book, and I didn't mean to skip to the book right ahead, but let's talk about it. Your book came out a couple of years ago. It's called Mr. Monkey and Me, and the things that I really, the things that spoke to me was this concept of Mr. Monkey is this fear and doubt that you have as an entrepreneur, and how do you handle the highs and lows of an entrepreneurship? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, what I looked at, and Kurt, you're obviously a very accomplished entrepreneur and author, so you know the trials and tribulations of both. But for me, I looked at the content that was available for entrepreneurs, and here's what I found. I found either the short blog post that talks about like what Mark Zuckerberg wears every day, and some kind of lightweight content that doesn't really make you feel good or help you, or very tactical, how to write a business plan or KPIs, which are important, but nothing really hit the mental aspect. And I wrote it after I had gone through the journey of ServiceSource and started Next Coast. And what I did was I pulled 20 plus amazing entrepreneurs, much more successful than I have been, and said, what do you think the biggest thing, what the drivers were? And from that, I was able to aggregate 5 key attributes, which we can talk about, that really speak to the mental aspect. Because every day in my job at Next Coast, and you've certainly seen it in your entrepreneurial career, the idea, while important, almost every big category has 7 or 8 competitors or more. And so one tends to emerge over time as the real victor. And I tend to believe that has to do with the mental aspect of the entrepreneur or the leader that can get through all of those ups and downs. And that's what the book really talks about.
I love it. So you're alluding to most business books are glamorous and pie in the sky, and my 5 tips to being, a $1 billion business and having sex on the beach every day. You have real practical advice. You break it down into 5 relatively simple sounding concepts. The SHAPE mentality. You want to talk a little bit about that? What does SHAPE stand for? And maybe the 2-minute overview.
Yeah. And real quick, I would hit like the monkey part. People ask, why is it named Mr. Monkey? To your point, it was about, at least for me, I think everyone has a voice inside their head. It may say different things. It may say different things to Kurt than it does to Mike. In my case, it was a lot of imposter syndrome, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What are you doing? And so rather than telling Mike Smerklo's story, which would be a good, 1.5-page blog post, as one of my dear friends reminds me, I brought the monkey in to be a caricature in the book. And, how I'm getting ready to do this podcast. oh, okay, what, I'm doing some prep, and the monkey voice is saying, oh, no one's really going to listen to you. Kurt's a great guy, but you're probably going to, all this stuff's going in my head. So how do you put that in a box and use it for good? And that really led to the formation of the SHAPE formula. 5 attributes: self-awareness, help, um, and help being a really interesting one, and then being authentic, persistence, and expectations, all different mental attributes. And each chapter ends with really specific monkey minders, I call them, things that you can do to help you get better at each one of those attributes.
Man, you touched on so many things that are endemic in the entrepreneurial community, and most people look at entrepreneurs as either assholes or the rich guys who made it. And what you just struck on is so many of us, and I use the word us because I have the same challenge: imposter syndrome. Am I really good enough? All those fear things you just described. I think that's part of what drives us to be so successful. Yep. Is that monkey on our back? Man, that's I love the way you laid that out there.
Yeah, and and the monkey can be a really powerful voice, right? I mean, like I grew up dirt poor kid from Toledo, Ohio. I was hell bent on proving myself in the world, and that's motivation and hard work and really persistence. But it can also show up. I mean, what I always thought I could quiet the voice. I mean, you've had a great career. I thought at some point when XYZ happened, whether it be a milestone or revenue or net worth, that the voice would go away. And I found the voice just kind of shifted. So he's a crafty bastard, would start using different things to get in my head, and still there today. So it's a little bit about just bringing him into the tent, sitting down with him and saying, okay, I got you. I understand what you're trying to do here, and understanding it. And, it's a lot of stuff that you and I are fortunate to be in YPO together. I think YPO is one of the very specific things that help you understand this stuff a little bit better.
I think it is, and it can be a challenge if you're trying to compare yourself to others. And so that's got some challenges in and of itself. So we could talk for hours about that. I do want to, I consider myself the listener's advocate, and I want to, if I'm here watching and listening to Mike Smerklo, venture capitalist who's done bought a company and sold it, what do I want to know? And the thing that jumped out at me was, and you talk to hundreds, if not thousands of entrepreneurs a year, what advice would you give someone who's coming to a venture capitalist for capital about secrets to raising capital is one question. The other one, maybe even before that, is, do you really need said capital? Or want said capital, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll hit the second one first, because I tell entrepreneurs all the time, if you can avoid taking money from firms like mine, I think we're a great firm, Austin-based, all that good stuff. But if you can avoid it, Michael Dell didn't raise any capital that I'm aware of. I don't think he did. Maybe a little friends and family. It seemed to work out okay for him. Some of the great companies in the world didn't raise venture capital. In fact, I still think something like 80% of companies that are formed and grow never raise venture capital. So I remind people all the time, which is not that we're a last resort, but there's a different cadence and expectations with venture capital versus bootstrap versus other sourcing. So I'm first person to say that. But if you do think you want to raise venture capital, you've got a business idea that's going to consume a lot of money to get to the next level. I think that I push people all the time to say, first and foremost, make sure it's a big enough idea. Life's too short to and I'm not saying like imagine it being the next Facebook. I'm saying just make sure it's something that has growth potential. Doesn't have to start there, but has growth potential. Second, make sure it's something that's differentiated. Everyone's busy, everyone's exhausted, everyone's tired, everyone's overwhelmed. So how is a consumer or a business going to change their behavior? So is there a unique attribute to the solution? And then third, and most importantly, though, is for us is, what do you want to really do this? We have a term at Next Coast we call glass eaters, and we came up with it because it's a very unsexy, unhealthy kind of term, but it's like great entrepreneurs are glass eaters. And that means we used to say like, hey, here's a pile of glass, give me some ketchup and mustard, and I'm going to eat the glass to get to the next step. Nothing outside of ethic or legal boundaries, but real persistence. And we can tell almost in the first meeting whether an entrepreneur, whether or not she has or doesn't have that attribute. And it tends to be the number one thing that we focus on.
Yeah, that entrepreneurial spirit and grit. We see it a lot with our recruiting when you're trying to hire a talent for your entrepreneurial company. And we use the phrase, are they leaning in, like when they hear about the challenges, like, tell me more, boss, I'm ready to go? Or are they kind of leaning back saying, yeah, So your sales guy, you talked about before, is very similar to the character in my book, which I know you know is called Who's Your Mike? And sorry about the title for my friends.
I love it.
But one of the characters, one of the archetypes, I should say, is Pipeline Paul. Pipeline Paul is the big swinging, sales guy you bring in from the outside, and he's more puffery than reality. And he or she doesn't have that lean in kind of mindset. They're more like lean back and I did really well at Dell or HP or some big software company. I might not struggle with your little pissant co is what I call it in the book.
Yeah, that's good. Well, they usually start stories with like, well, back at Dell, pat you on the head. Yes, little entrepreneur, that's an interesting idea. But back at Dell, and you're like, okay, yeah, I know Pipeline Paul way too well.
I think we all do. We all do. So I want to touch on something that's got me curious about you, and I know you're big on entrepreneurialism for the betterment of society. I call it capitalism for good. Tell me a little bit about that. And you also like to quote a lot of Teddy Roosevelt in your social. Is there a tie in there between the two?
Yeah, well, I think Teddy Roosevelt. Such an inspirational character, a big fan, so I can talk about that if that's useful. But listen, I believe entrepreneurship and entrepreneurialism will solve the biggest problems in the world. And I think the world needs more entrepreneurs. We need more diversity entrepreneurs, and we need more mentally stable and strong entrepreneurs. That's why I wrote the book. But I think to your point, every problem I'm looking at in society, and unfortunately, as always, there's a gazillion of them, would I rather have an incredibly smart, motivated, entrepreneurial mindset addressing that problem, or a charity or a government or other entity? And at the end of the day, take electric vehicles, right? That concept's been around forever. It took someone, i.e. Elon Musk, to finally say, I'm crazy enough to do it. And now what we're seeing in the entire following, the fast followers of all the big automobiles, we're finally going to get to where we all wanted to be on electric vehicles. But not for Elon Musk, I don't know if we would have gotten there. And so I think you just have that continual push around everything. And my push is to have people that are thinking about entrepreneurship to take the plunge, do the work, think about the challenges, make sure you're in the right mental state. But if you're out there and thinking about it, I would just encourage you to go for it.
Yeah, I think if we can solve the world's problems, if we can find a way to monetize the solving of those said problems, as you said, like Elon with the electric vehicles, that's the true turning point where we're not relying on government handouts or charity.
Yeah. And it's okay to do it for profit too. I mean, I'm not speaking ill of ESG investments, but I just, profit motive is an okay thing. Someone said to me once, it's like, a lot of great, the libraries around the world are named after people that went out and created big businesses, made a tremendous amount of money, and then gave that back. So I'm not just capitalism for capitalism's sake, but I think a profit motive is not a bad thing.
Mike, the title of the show is Unlocking Moves, where we talk about those key pivotal moments or decision points which really change the trajectory of your career. So let's talk about you. Mike, what was your unlocking move or moves?
Yeah, I mean, I won't go back to my full gory, boring details of not having role models. I grew up in a dirt poor, a lot of alcohol problems, divorce, et cetera. So I didn't have any good role models. So I would just say, I give that as context because when I was just getting going, I just wanted to go make some money. My first job was a CPA. I made $27,000 and instantly became the highest paid Smerklo in the history of Smerklos. So that gives you perspective. But I would say for my real unlocking move, I knew when I was in my 20s, I had jobs that were, I was a public accountant, which I hated. I was an investment banker, which I enjoyed the intellectual stimulation, but I wasn't in the game. And I desperately wanted to be in the game. And I wanted to be running something, and I wanted to have the ball, as they say in sports. So my real unlocking move was I got lucky, and then I got introduced to Mark Andreessen. He was just starting a company called Loud Cloud, which Ben Horowitz wrote one of the best business books, The Hard Thing About the Hard Thing. I lived chapters 0 through 7, but Mark invited me to come work for him at this startup. Mind you, I had just made that my bonus that year at Morgan Stanley was $500,000, and they offered me $1 million to stay, and I was 28. I'll never forget calling. I was raised by a single mother. It was, the late bubble. It was the .com boom. I called my mom. Single mom raised me, and I explained it to her. And she said, a good Irish Catholic who's no longer with us said, you could be shoveling poop in hell and you should take that money. Like that was her mindset, because it was just impossible to think about. But I took a pause and said, I was fortunate at a point in my life where I didn't have a lot of, I didn't have kids, I didn't have a house, I didn't have really much to tie me down. And I thought, I really want to jump in and learn what it's like to be an entrepreneur. And this seems like the lowest risk time to do it, even though I had this ginormous amount of money. I thought, I'm going to take it. And so I would say my biggest unlock move in terms of entrepreneurship is I jumped in and I got to go work for 4 amazing founders, go from a concept all the way through IPO and see what that entailed. I learned a tremendous amount from it. And then that motivated me to quit and go buy a business and try it for myself.
Wow. So that's so powerful for a number of reasons. One is I work with executives in transition or candidates all the time, every day. And oftentimes they have that opportunity to go join something else, change their status or whatever, and they're accept the counteroffer for $5,000 more, or they're fearful of making the change. You just showed us that you can absolutely unlock your potential with something that sounds counterintuitive in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was, then they like the punchline of this. So the funny part, Kurt, is that this was kind of when the stock market, the Nasdaq was on its massive ascendancy in 1999, a gazillion years ago. And we all thought the options. I mean, to be clear, I thought I was going to make a lot of money working for this startup. I mean, it was the hottest startup. Mark Andreessen had already been on the cover of Time when he was 22. So, I mean, there was an economic motive to it. I ended up buying, I think, maybe a motorbike, not a motorbike, a mountain bike out of it. So it did not turn out economically as I expected, but it really pushed me in a different direction. And I do think, though, one thing interesting for me, Kurt, on this is I was lucky that was the right time in my life and my career. And one of the things I would always encourage folks to think about entrepreneurship is make sure that it's the right time for you. There is a timing and element to life. And I don't think it's an age thing. It's not 22 or 52. It's just about, do you want to take on that risk? Are you mentally strong? As I mentioned before, do you have the support structure around you? I mean, these things really matter in terms of success. And sometimes it may be better to wait for a little bit and take that job with paying you a little bit more.
Well, you definitely can't do it on your own. So I like your support analogy. So I've got another question for you that I want to find out something about Mike that nobody else knows. All right. So I like to ask, what is one question that no one ever asks you that you wish they would, or maybe you're kind of glad they don't?
Oh, I knew this. Yeah, there's so many of these. I mean, I think that the one thing that I probably no one asked me, because you go on these, unfortunately, all the proceeds of this book go to charity. So I promoted it to try and help drive a charity I set up to support emerging and diverse and underrepresented entrepreneurs, a scholarship. So I do these podcasts, I talk about all this stuff, I go through it. I don't think anyone has ever asked me, what were the downsides? And I think the downside, which seems like a little bit of a generic question, but when I look at all the things I went through, there's a lot of scar tissue from it. And I'm always surprised, and I'm sure you could relate to this, is that I don't talk about the scar tissue. I don't talk about, trying to ups and downs in marriage. Was I the best father? Like there's just scar tissue, and some of it, maybe it's imagination or not, or friendships there's just a lot of things that go into being entrepreneurship that when I start talking about, I'm like, ooh, gosh, I don't want to talk about this stuff. I'd rather talk about, ring the bell on the NASDAQ and how exciting that was. But I tend to think that's the point of conversation. And I think you're probably going to start getting this more in your podcast. I think it's a great idea. What you're doing is really trying to make sure people understand all the stuff that goes into it. And there's I have amazing memories, amazing friendships, all this fun stuff, but scar tissue along the way.
That's a great point. How many times you work your tail off to get to where you think you're successful financially and professionally, and you sacrifice your family in the background. There's a local CPA firm that has a phrase, something like along the lines of, no success at work is worth failure at home. And that's Earl Maxwell of Maxwell Luck and Ritter. I always remember that quote. So, Mike, where can we find out more about you? Give us a website, Twitter handle, whatever you think makes most sense.
Yeah, so the book, Mr. Monkey Me, I appreciate the chance to talk about it. Available on Amazon. Again, all proceeds go to charity. MikeSmerklo.com, SMERKLO.com is my website and Twitter handle. There you can, at that site, there's a free "Are you ready to be an entrepreneur?" test. It's got a lot of where I write on my blog post about this very topic. And I'm on the same on all social under Mike Smerklo. And then Next Coast Ventures, Austin-based, looking for the next great entrepreneur. That's just nextcoastventures.com.
So if we want money, at Mike Smerklo or also nextcoastventures.com.
Exactly. Just send in your idea. We'll wire the money immediately. That's how it works.
Hey, Mike, on that note, we're going to wrap this puppy up. Everybody, thank you so much for joining. Please like and subscribe to Unlocking Moves wherever you consume your podcasts, also on YouTube. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Kurt. It was a blast. I really appreciate it.
If you're an entrepreneur and you think you might have outgrown a member of your team, or maybe you've got a mic, as we talked about in Who's Your Mic, check out this quiz at who'syourmic.com/quiz. That's who'syourmic.com/quiz.